Absolutely. And I think that's a really powerful way to provide framing to people who are typically conflict avoidant in terms of what is the cost of not speaking up versus the cost of speaking up, because each has consequences, as you said.
They
And
do.
often if we avoid, we're not necessarily thinking about those consequences. We're only thinking about kind of the worst case scenario. If I do bring it up,
Yes, I know. So the question now becomes, what if I don't bring it up?
hmm
Then what happens? Then what happens?
yes, yes.
Um, no, no, go ahead.
I was going to share from the book Crucial Conversations, which I'm
Yeah,
sure you're familiar with. They had a saying that was something like, if you're not saying it out loud, you're going to act it out in some other way.
yeah,
Something around, even if you're avoiding and holding it in, it's going to sneak out in other ways
yeah.
that are not going to be very productive.
I always use this example of if I knock over your water one day after we've been in conflict for a while and I do it by accident, I don't even know that we're in conflict. I knock over your water and you punch me in the face. It's not about the water. It's really about something else. So that is very true that it's going to come out somehow. It just may not be coming out in your words. So you're engaging in the conflict. You're just engaging in a different way.
Yeah, exactly.
So, as we talk about this around inner work and just how things show up from maybe a nonverbal standpoint, how do emotions show up in conflict in other ways? And what can leaders learn by paying a closer attention to your emotions? Because sometimes when an emotion conflict comes up, there are emotions. I always say that our body tells us exactly what's going on. How do we teach leaders how to pay closer attention to those emotions and then what to actually do with them?
Yeah, great question. So, conflict is a very mind body experience,
Hmm.
And so I appreciate your question around emotions in conflict. And so I think there's a few things. One being becoming aware and naming those emotions, even if it's just for yourself, is powerful. So what is it that I'm feeling? And even just the simple idea of naming it can help people become aware and then also not be just driven by it without knowing what's going on. And then there's also this idea around our stress response, which comes up very naturally in conflict. And so understanding that will happen, and how do we manage that physical response in terms of whatever the technique is that you use, whether it be deep breathing, whether it be
Hmm.
taking a short break, just disconnecting that cycle, that response that our brains naturally go into, that then affects our body as well. And that often leads us to being either defending something or attacking something.
Yes.
And so getting out of that response by naming emotions, by also being aware in the workplace. I think we've come a long way in terms of the idea that emotions are present in the workplace. I feel like
Yeah.
when I started my career, it was this idea that we somehow left them at the door and that we just walked in and we're like, we're here to do work.
Which is impossible, right? To leave those
Right.
emotions. Yeah. That's when they start to really act those emotions out, maybe not show them in a way that is emotional, but you're showing it in some way in your actions.
Exactly, exactly. And so becoming comfortable and aware of that. And then also what emotions are acceptable in your workplace. Different
Yeah.
workplaces might things show up differently and cultures show up differently. So understanding how that might be impacting how you're feeling and then how you're acting it out and or just the actions you're taking and what's accepted and what's not.
Yeah. Well, and that piece around listening to your emotions, I love what you said about deep breathing, because that's really important. And really pausing and thinking about what your next action could be. Because if you are feeling those emotions, it is important to avoid it in the moment. You're going to have to come back to it because it's not going to fix itself. But it's important to walk away from it because we're not emotionally ready to
Mhm.
engage in that conflict. However, we've got to circle back to it. That's like the only time where it's important to walk away is when you feel like you might say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing, because a lot of things can happen when you're in conflict.
Yeah, yeah. You want to be driven by your goals and by your intentionality as opposed to your knee-jerk reaction
Right.
to the situation.
Exactly. Andrea, have you seen moments where conflict actually brought people closer together? And if so, what made that possible?
Absolutely. Um, have worked with a number of leadership teams that, having gone through a process of spending the time to sit down, both individually and with together, um, and really get underneath what the conflict is for each person. So doing some of that unpacking, because like we were talking about earlier, if it's something that's been going on for a while, you've kind of got to unravel that ball of yarn and
Yeah.
let people have the opportunity to share what they've been experiencing. And even that process alone of shining light on what's going on can be very powerful. And so I have seen people absolutely improve their working relationships by having the opportunity to talk openly about what's going on, and then having the opportunity to practice behaving differently, because that's the other piece of it, right? If you're not acting out of kind of your old habit or what wasn't getting you the results you wanted before, shifting to practicing new habits
Yeah.
also takes work. And so having the opportunity to practice even in little small steps to change a dynamic can really have an effect on relationships and
Yes.
collaboration at work.
You all heard that. Small steps, just taking those small steps is definitely worth it. Now, I know, Andrea, you are a coach and you coach around these things with conflict. What advice do you have for leaders on how to reframe conflict so it really becomes a tool for growth rather than a threat to that harmony that we talked about?
Yeah, I think looking first at what your goals are and whether your relationships and your culture are supporting those goals, and then whether you're creating the time and space needed to allow for generative or healthy conflict. And if it's not something you've been doing before, it's going to take a lot of encouragement. It's going to take someone, and maybe it's you as a leader, maybe it's you designate your HR lead, someone to really mine for those opportunities. If people aren't used to flexing that muscle, then it's going to take support to be able to raise issues in a meeting, have a direct conversation with a colleague about, whether it be a feedback situation or a disagreement. So I think that knowing that it's going to require that support and growth to move towards a organization that embraces healthy conflict is important.
Awesome. Awesome. This is my last question. Since we're talking about the human side of conflict, what do you wish every leader understood about people and not policies when it comes to managing conflict?
I love that question. That conflict leads to growth, and that it is possible to separate issues that feel deeply personal or triggering or impossible. It's possible to separate those issues. Conflict doesn't always have to trigger this. I'm a bad leader. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Like um, it doesn't have to be as divisive as we
Right.
sometimes think it's going to be.
Well, I love that you just said that. It doesn't have to be as divisive, because it actually can bring us, as you talked about with sharing your story, bring us together. And that's what it should do, is to really bring us together. And if we could really, we have a program called Conflict Reimagined, and
Mhm.
I titled it Conflict Reimagined because I really wanted people to reimagine what conflict looks like,
Mm.
because it's so important, like as you've shared with us, that conflict is going to happen. But the question is, how do we use our emotions? How do we use our words? How do we connect in a different way? And how do we just see conflict and reframe it so that we can have more healthy conflict? And I was in a session and somebody said, that sounds like an oxymoron. How can you have healthy conflict? But it's really about having conflict where you're actually moving towards something rather than pulling apart something.
Mm-hmm.
That's destructive.
Yes. Yes. And that's a really important point too. When you're engaged in healthy conflict and in conflict that is generative and is moving you forward, you are focused on those ideas,
Yeah.
those breakthroughs, those things that are going to move your business forward. And you're not distracted by kind of the bickering relationship or the colleague that didn't do what you wanted them to do. You're not distracted by all of these other aspects of conflict. You're actually focused on that result that you want to
Yeah.
achieve and
Yeah.
really bring you to a new place.
Awesome. Focus on the results that you want to achieve. I think that's a great way to end our session for today. So, Andrea, thank you so much. That's a wrap. This episode of What's in the News for Leaders. Andrea, if anyone, where I know you do this for coaching, if anyone were looking for additional information, where can they find you?
Yeah, they can find me on my website, andreagilliam.com. I'm also on LinkedIn, and they can find me there as well.
Okay. A huge thank you to you for sharing your insight on what it really means to think about conflict in a different way. Remember, conflict isn't the opposite of collaboration, it's often the path to it. If this episode sparked a new perspective or gave you something to practice in your next conversation, share it with a leader who could use it too. For more leadership tools or to learn how Willow North helps organizations build clarity, courage, and collaboration, visit us at willownorth.com. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and keep leading forward. Thank you.